The Arizona sun in 1883 didn't just shine, it punished. It beat down on Solomon Tate's soul just as hard as it beat down on the cracked red earth of his ranch. Solomon was 52, but he felt 100. The years since the war hadn't been kind. They'd carved lines into his face like canyons and left a permanent stoop in his shoulders, as if he were still carrying the weight of fallen comrades. He'd come out to this forsaken corner of the territory to be left alone, to let his ghosts fade into the shimmering heat. But ghosts have a funny way of sticking around. His ranch was dying. 3 years of drought had bled it dry. The cattle were mostly gone, just a handful of bony beasts that stared at him with hollow eyes. And the well, his lifeblood, had turned against him. It gave up a foul, brackish sludge that tasted of bitterness and despair. Every morning he'd lower the bucket, a small prayer dying on his lips before it could even form. And every morning the same muddy disappointment would rise to meet him. It was a ritual of failure. As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, a sound cut through the evening stillness. It was a whimper, soft but sharp enough to make the hairs on his arms stand up. It was coming from the barn. Solomon's hand went to the Colt, 45 on his hip, a gesture as natural as breathing. In this land, innocence was often just a mask worn by danger. He moved slow, his boots silent in the thick dust. He pushed the heavy barn door, the groan of the hinges sounding like a warning. The inside of the barn was thick with shadows and the smell of dry hay. He scanned the familiar shapes, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, and then he saw them. Huddled in a corner, trying to make themselves small, were 3 children. Native children. The oldest was a girl, maybe 12, with eyes that held the wisdom of an old woman. She had her arms wrapped tight around 2 little boys, shielding them with her own frail body. Their clothes were rags, their faces smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. They were nothing but skin and bones. The girl's voice was a dry crackle, a whisper of heavily accented English. "Please, mister, we just need to rest. We won't take nothing." Solomon's mind screamed suspicion. The Apache were restless, and settlers were on edge. Harboring these kids could bring a world of trouble down on his head. From both sides. He was a man who had built his life around avoiding trouble. But as he looked closer, the hardened shell around his heart began to crack. He saw the hollows in their cheeks, the feverish glint in their eyes. The youngest boy, no more than 6, let out a weak, rattling cough that shook his entire body. Solomon had seen this before. He knew the look of slow starvation, of dehydration. These weren't a threat. They were just children. And they were dying. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked, his voice a low growl that surprised even himself. "3 days," the girl said, her chin held high, a flicker of pride in her defiance. "Maybe 4. There was a sickness in our village. We had to run." Something moved in Solomon's chest, a feeling so old and buried he barely recognized it. It felt like a thaw after a long winter. Compassion. He saw the faces of his own children, taken by a fever back in Missouri, a lifetime ago. He saw their small, still forms. And in that moment, these 3 strangers were no longer strangers. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to. He just knew he couldn't leave them there. "Come on, then," he grunted, stepping back from the door. "Let's get some food in you." The children didn't move. They stared at him, their dark eyes wide with an uncertainty that was painful to watch. Trust was a currency they didn't have. "I ain't going to hurt you," Solomon said, his voice softer this time. "But if you stay out here, the desert will finish what it started." Slowly, the girl helped her brothers to their feet. They followed him across the yard, their bare feet making no sound on the hard earth. The old rancher walked ahead, the weight of their gaze on his back. He didn't know what god or devil had brought them to his door, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same again. Inside the small adobe house, the children stood near the door as if ready to bolt. The girl, Ayana, kept her brothers, Nalish and Bidiel, tucked behind her. Their eyes darted around the room, taking in the strange new world of a white man's home. Solomon gestured to the rough wooden table. "Sit," he said, his voice still gruff. He busied himself at the hearth, pulling out beans and hardtack and the last of his dried jerky. It wasn't much, but to them it might as well have been a feast. As they ate, he watched them. They ate with a desperate, silent intensity. Ayana made sure her brothers got the most, her own hunger secondary to theirs. It was a small act of love and sacrifice that hit Solomon harder than a punch. He saw his wife in that gesture, the way she used to always give their children the best parts of any meal. The memory was a ghost that sat down at the table with them. "Where are you headed?" he asked, breaking the silence. Ayana swallowed before she spoke. "North, to Flagstaff. We have family there. We hope." "That's a long walk for little ones," Solomon said, glancing at their bare, bruised feet. "We had no choice," she said, and her voice was heavy with a sorrow no child should ever know. "The soldiers, they came. They said we had to go to a reservation. But the sickness came first. It took our parents." The words just hung there in the air, thick and heavy. Solomon knew that kind of loss. He knew how it could hollow you out until you were nothing but a shell. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt small and useless, but he meant them. Ayana looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "You are not like the other white men we have met." "Maybe," Solomon said, pouring them each a cup of the murky water from his barrel. It was all he had. "Or maybe I just know what it's like to lose everything." He asked her about her village. She spoke of a place by a river, of cottonwood trees, and her mother's beautiful pottery. Her father had been a medicine man, a keeper of old ways. It sounded like a paradise. Then her voice dropped. "The fever came so fast. The old medicines didn't work. We had to leave the dead where they fell." Solomon felt a familiar rage build in him, not at the children, but at the senseless cruelty of the world. He'd seen enough of it in the war to last 10 lifetimes. After the children had eaten their fill, they fell asleep almost instantly on a pile of blankets by the fire. Their small chests rose and fell in a steady rhythm. For the first time in a long, long time, the house didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Solomon lay in his own bed, staring up into the darkness, listening to the sound of their breathing and the whisper of the desert wind. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. But a new feeling was creeping in alongside the comfort, a cold, sharp sense of dread. He had let the world in, and he knew the world always came with a price. The next morning, Solomon woke to a strange sight. Ayana was by the hearth, carefully tending the fire. Her brothers were awake, watching her with a quiet intensity. She looked up as he entered the room, her expression guarded. "I hope it is okay," she said, "to thank you." Solomon just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He grabbed his bucket and headed for the well, the children trailing behind him like curious ducklings. It was time for his daily dose of disappointment. He worked the rope and pulley, his muscles moving with grim familiarity. He was so used to the murky, bitter water that he didn't even bother to look as the bucket came up. But Ayana did. "The water," she whispered, her eyes wide. "It is different," Solomon grunted, not believing it. "It's always bad." "No," she said, her voice firm. "Look." He finally looked, and his heart stopped. The water in the bucket wasn't murky. It wasn't brown. It was clear. Impossibly, unbelievably clear. It sparkled in the morning sun like a bucket of liquid diamonds. He stared, dumbfounded. This couldn't be right. It had to be a trick of the light. He dipped a hand in, the water cool and clean against his skin. He brought a handful to his lips and drank. It was sweet, pure, the best water he had ever tasted. "How?" he breathed, looking from the bucket to the girl. Ayana simply smiled, a small, knowing smile. "My grandfather taught us. Water has a memory. It remembers the earth it touches. It remembers the hands that draw it up." "That's just old stories," Solomon stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. He lowered the bucket again, his heart pounding. He had to be sure. He hauled it up, and it was the same. Crystal clear. "He said the earth knows our hearts," Ayana continued softly, as if explaining something very simple. "When we act with kindness, the land takes notice. It gives back." Solomon wanted to laugh. He wanted to call it a coincidence. But he'd lived in the desert long enough to know there were no coincidences. He had taken in 3 starving children, and his poisoned well had healed itself overnight. The 2 events were connected. He didn't know how, but he knew it in his bones. This wasn't just water. This was something else. This was magic. And magic, he knew, always had a dark side. A part of him was terrified. Because if an act of kindness could do this, what could an act of hatred do? The day passed in a haze of disbelief. Solomon drew bucket after bucket of the miraculous water, half expecting it to revert to its old, foul state. But it never did. The children seemed to take it in stride, as if a healed well was the most natural thing in the world. As the sun began to set, Ayana grew quiet. "We should go," she said, her voice small. "We have taken too much of your kindness." Solomon looked at them. 3 small, impossibly brave children. The thought of them walking back out into that brutal wilderness made his chest ache. The thought of his house returning to its silent, lonely state was even worse. "Stay," he said, the word escaping before he could stop it. "Stay a while, until you're stronger. We can send word to Flagstaff. We'll find your people." The relief on their faces was like the sun breaking through clouds. They had found more than just a place to rest. They had found a refuge. But as they settled in for the night, Solomon couldn't shake a growing unease. The well was a miracle, yes, but miracles draw attention. And in this harsh land, attention was the last thing you ever wanted. He had a feeling their troubles were far from over. In fact, they might have just begun. A week turned into 2, then 3. A new rhythm established itself on the ranch. It was a rhythm of life, not just survival. Ayana, with her quiet competence, ran the small house better than Solomon ever had. The boys, Nalish and Bidiel, followed him everywhere, their initial fear replaced by a relentless curiosity. They were learning the ways of the ranch, and in turn they were teaching Solomon how to live again. The sound of their laughter echoed in the dusty yard, chasing away the ghosts of his past. The well continued to produce its clear, sweet water. The cattle grew stronger. His small garden, which had always struggled, was now bursting with life. It was as if the entire ranch was breathing a sigh of relief. But the biggest change was in Solomon himself. The bitterness that had been his constant companion for years began to recede, replaced by a feeling he'd long forgotten: hope. But the youngest boy, Bidiel, wasn't getting better. While Ayana and Nalish had regained their strength, Bidiel remained frail. He had a persistent, rattling cough and a fever that came and went. The clean water didn't seem to be helping him. If anything, he was getting weaker. Solomon watched the boy, his heart twisting with a familiar dread. He looked so much like his own son, Thomas, in those last terrible days. The fear was a cold hand gripping his heart. The miracle of the well felt like a cruel joke if it couldn't save this one small child. One evening, as Bidiel shivered with fever by the fire, Solomon saw the desperation in Ayana's eyes. "The water is not enough," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "The sickness that took our village, it was not a normal fever. It was a poison. Solomon froze. Poison? What are you talking about? White men, she said, her voice dropping so low he could barely hear it. They came to our village before the soldiers. They wanted the land. They said there was shiny rock in the ground. Our elders told them to leave. After they left, the river turned strange. People started to get sick. A cold fury washed over Solomon. This wasn't a tragedy. This was a massacre. Why didn't you tell me this before? We were afraid, she said simply. You are a white man. The words hit him like a physical blow. He looked at the sick child, at the fierce, protective girl, and felt a wave of shame. He had been so focused on his own miracle, he'd missed the horror story right in front of him. What can we do? He asked, his voice raw. Ayanna looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She was deciding whether to trust him with the rest of her secret. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. My father was a medicine man. He knew the secrets of the earth. He told me that for every poison, the land provides a cure. He said this sickness needed two things to be fought: pure water and the ghost lily. The ghost lily? Solomon had heard of it. A rare desert flower that bloomed only at night in the highest, most treacherous parts of the nearby mesas. It was said to be almost impossible to find. The flower unlocks the healing in the water, Ayanna explained. It turns the water into medicine. My father was on his way to find it when he was killed. The weight of her words settled on him. This wasn't just about finding a flower anymore. This was about finishing a murdered man's last act. It was about saving this child. And maybe, just maybe, it was about atoning for the sins of his own people. I'll go, Solomon said without a second's hesitation. I'll find it. He looked over at Bidiel, whose breathing was becoming shallow. He didn't have much time. It is dangerous, Ayanna warned. The mesas are a difficult place. I've seen worse, Solomon said, his mind already turning to the supplies he would need. As he prepared to leave at dawn, a new, terrifying thought struck him. He would be leaving the children alone, vulnerable. He thought of his nearest neighbor, Jebediah Thorne, a man with a greedy heart and a cruel streak. Thorne had been eyeing Solomon's land for years. If Thorne found out about the clear water and the children... A chill ran down Solomon's spine that had nothing to do with the night air. He was walking into one danger and leaving another one right at his doorstep. Solomon rode out at first light, pushing his horse hard. The image of Bidiel's pale face was burned into his mind. He had to find that flower. He had to. As he rode, the vast, silent desert seemed to mock him. It was a land of secrets and sudden death. A place that could give you a miracle one day and snatch it away the next. Back at the ranch, Ayanna watched him go, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She had trusted him. She had told him her people's deepest secrets. Now she and her brothers were alone. She tried to keep busy, tending to Bidiel, forcing him to drink small sips of the well water. Naelish, her other brother, stayed close, his young face set in a permanent frown of worry. He was trying to be the man of the house, but he was only 7. The morning passed slowly. Then, around noon, they heard the sound of hoofbeats. It wasn't Solomon. It was 2 riders approaching fast. Ayanna's heart leaped into her throat. She recognized one of the men, Jebediah Thorne. He had a face like a hawk and eyes that missed nothing. He had visited Solomon once before, and Ayanna had not liked the way he looked at their small ranch, at their well. Thorne reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the property. He noticed the small, thriving garden immediately. His eyes narrowed. He dismounted, walking over to the well with a proprietary air. He worked the pulley and drew up a bucket. When he saw the clear water, a low whistle escaped his lips. His eyes glittered with greed. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice slick as snake oil. "Looks like old Solomon's luck has finally turned." He turned his cold gaze on Ayana, who stood frozen in the doorway of the house. "Where's Tate?" He went to hunt," Ayana stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. Thorne's lips curled into a sneer. He took a long drink from the bucket, then poured the rest out onto the thirsty ground, a gesture of pure waste and arrogance. Hunting? Or did he finally kick the bucket and leave this place to rot? He took a step toward her. "You kids all alone out here?" Nalish stepped in front of his sister, holding a small rock in his hand. It was a pathetic gesture, but a brave one. Thorne just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Look at this. A little prairie dog thinking he's a wolf." He looked past them into the house and saw Bidiel lying on the blankets by the fire. "What's wrong with that one? Got the fever?" "He is just tired," Ayana said quickly. Thorne wasn't stupid. He put the pieces together. The sudden miracle of the water. The Indian children. The sick one. "I see," he said slowly, a dark understanding dawning in his eyes. "There's some kind of devilry going on here. The law might be interested to know old Tate is harboring stray Apaches, especially ones who practice their dark magic on a white man's land." He mounted his horse, his companion smirking beside him. "You tell Solomon I'll be back," Thorne said, his voice laced with menace. "And I might just bring the sheriff with me. We'll see how he explains all this." He spurred his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick silence behind him. Ayana grabbed her brothers and pulled them inside, barring the door. The ticking clock had started. Thorne wasn't going to bring the sheriff. She knew it. He wanted the well. He wanted the land. And he would do anything to get it. They were trapped. The climb was brutal. Solomon, guided by Ayana's description, pushed himself up the sheer rock face of the mesa. The sun hammered down on him, and the dry air seared his lungs. His body screamed in protest. He wasn't a young man anymore. With every handhold, with every scraped knuckle, ghosts of his past rose up to meet him. He saw the faces of the men he had killed in the war. He saw the terror in their eyes, the surprise, the final emptiness. He had been a good soldier. Too good. He had followed orders even when they turned his stomach. He remembered one particular raid. A village, not unlike the one Ayana had described. They had been told it was a nest of hostiles. But when they got there, it was mostly old men, women, and children. They had burned it to the ground. An order was an order. He could still hear the screams. He had tried to bury that memory, but it had festered inside him for decades. Now, climbing this rock to save a child from a different, but no less cruel, massacre, it all came rushing back. This wasn't just for Badiel. This was for them, too. This was his penance. He finally pulled himself over the last ledge, his body trembling with exhaustion. The top of the mesa was a different world, flat, windswept, and dotted with strange, twisted plants. According to Ayana, the ghost lily only grew in the shadow of a balanced rock, and it only bloomed after the moon was high in the sky. He had to wait. As darkness fell, the desert came alive with new sounds. The temperature plummeted. Solomon built a small fire and huddled by it, scanning the horizon. The moon rose, a perfect silver disk in the inky blackness. He began his search, his eyes straining in the pale moonlight. For hours he found nothing. Despair began to creep in. What if he couldn't find it? What if he was too late? He thought of Bidiel, his small, frail body. He thought of Ayana's terrified, trusting eyes. He couldn't fail. He pushed on, his legs aching, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. And then he saw it. In the deep shadow of a massive boulder perched precariously on a thin spire of rock was a single, pale flower. It glowed with a faint, ethereal light, its petals translucent like spun moonlight. The ghost lily. He carefully dug it up, roots and all, wrapping it in a piece of damp cloth. He had it. A surge of triumph and relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Now came the hard part, getting back, and he had a terrible feeling that he was riding back into a trap. Back at the ranch, the hours crawled by. Every gust of wind, every skittering lizard sounded like the return of Jebediah Thorne. Ayanna clutched a small leather pouch she always wore around her neck. Inside was her most precious possession, a small clay figurine of a horse, intricately carved. Her mother had made it just before she died. She had told Ayanna it was for the one who would show them true kindness. But it was more than that. It was her mother's last secret. The clay wasn't just clay. It was mixed with a fine, shimmery dust, the shiny rock the white men had killed for. Silver. Her mother, a potter, had known the earth's secrets just as her father, the medicine man, had. She had known the silver vein ran right under their village. The figurine was proof. It was their story, their legacy, baked into the earth itself. Ayanna knew its true purpose, and she was terrified she might have to use it. Bidiel's breathing grew more ragged. Ayanna bathed his forehead with a cool cloth, whispering old songs her mother used to sing. Nalish stood guard at the small window, his knuckles white as he clutched his small stone. The sun began to set again, casting long, menacing shadows across the yard, and then they heard it, the sound of hoofbeats, not one horse or two, but several. It was Thorne, and he hadn't brought the sheriff. He'd brought two other men, rough-looking men with rifles cradled in their arms. The men dismounted, their spurs jingling with a sound like death bells. Thorne strode to the door and kicked it hard. "Open up, Tate. I know you're in there." When there was no answer, he laughed. "Don't matter. This land is mine now." He and his men shouldered the door, and it splintered inward with a terrible crash. Ayanna screamed, pulling her brothers behind her as the three men filled the small room, blocking out the last of the evening light. Thorne's eyes were cold and dead. "Now," he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips, "let's talk about this miracle well of yours, and then we're gonna get rid of the evidence." He looked directly at the three children. His meaning was horribly clear. They were the evidence. Solomon rode like a madman, the precious ghost lily tucked safely in his saddlebag. The moon was his only guide, and a rising sense of dread was his only companion. He was pushing his horse to its limit, but he just knew, he was running out of time. As he crested the final ridge overlooking his small ranch, his blood ran cold. There were torches in his yard. 3 horses stood near the well. The door to his house was hanging off its hinges, a dark, gaping wound. He didn't need to guess what was happening. Thorne had come back. He dismounted, pulling his Colt. 45. The old instincts of war took over. He became the man he had tried to leave behind, the man who knew how to move without a sound, the man who knew how to kill. He crept through the darkness, the element of surprise his only advantage. He was 1 man against 3. The odds were not good, but he wasn't just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting for his family. Inside the house, Thorne had backed Ayanna and the boys into a corner. "The girl knows something," Thorne said to his men. "These little savages always have their secrets. Some kind of ritual to make the water clean. You're gonna tell me what it is." He grabbed Ayanna by the arm. She cried out in pain. That's when Nalish acted. With a small, fierce cry, he hurled the rock he'd been clutching. It wasn't a big rock, but his aim was true. It struck one of Thorne's hired guns squarely in the temple. The man staggered back, dropping his rifle with a clatter, a look of pure shock on his face. It was the opening Solomon needed. He burst through the broken doorway, his pistol roaring. The second hired gun, startled by Nalish's attack, was too slow to react. Solomon's bullet caught him in the shoulder, and he went down screaming. Thorne, enraged, shoved Ayanna aside and drew his own pistol. He fired, the shot going wide, splintering the wooden table. The small room was suddenly filled with smoke, the smell of gunpowder, and the sounds of chaos. Solomon ducked behind the table as another shot from Thorn rang out. He was pinned down. The first hired gun was shaking off the blow from the rock, reaching for his fallen rifle. It was all going wrong. They were going to be overwhelmed. But then something else happened, something no one could have predicted. BDL, the sick little boy who had been lying weakly by the fire, suddenly sat up. His eyes were clear. The fever seemed to have broken. He looked at his sister, then at the man grabbing for the rifle. With a speed that was startling, he grabbed a small, smooth stone from the hearth. In one fluid motion, he fitted it into a small leather slingshot that had been hidden in his blanket. He drew back and fired. The stone flew across the room, a deadly blur, and struck the hired gun's hand with a sickening crack. The man howled in pain, his hand shattered. Solomon stared in amazement. The children were fighting back. They were not helpless. They were warriors. He used the moment of distraction to lunge from behind the table, tackling Thorn. The two men crashed to the floor, wrestling for control of Thorn's pistol. They were a tangle of limbs, grunting and cursing. Solomon was older, but he was wiry and strong, fueled by a righteous fury. He slammed Thorn's hand against the hard-packed earth floor again and again, until the pistol finally clattered free. But Thorn was a cornered animal. He shoved Solomon off him and scrambled toward the door, toward the well. "You can't have it!" he screamed, his eyes wild with greed and madness. "It's mine!" Solomon got to his feet, his body screaming in protest, his pistol aimed at Thorn's back. "It's over, Jebediah!" Thorn reached the well, turning to face them, a maniacal grin on his face. "It's never over." He held a small pouch in his hand. "You think your water is so pure. Let's see how pure it is with a dose of this." It was arsenic. He was going to poison the well, to destroy the one thing he couldn't have. He was about to dump the poison in when Ayanna screamed, "No!" She ran forward, not toward Thorn, but toward the well. In her hand was the small clay horse figurine. "My mother's gift," she cried out, and with all her might she threw it, not at Thorn, but directly into the mouth of the well. The figurine hit the water with a small splash. For a second, nothing happened. Thorn laughed, a hollow, empty sound. "A child's toy? That's your great magic?" And then the water began to bubble, not a gentle simmer, but a violent, churning boil. A thick, silvery vapor, shimmering in the torchlight, began to rise from the well. It smelled of ozone and hot metal. Thorn, standing right over the wellhead, took a deep breath before he could stop himself. His eyes went wide. He clawed at his throat, making a horrible gurgling sound. The vapor was clinging to him, enveloping him in a strange glowing mist. He staggered back, his face contorted in agony, and then collapsed to the ground, twitching. The bubbling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The vapor dissipated. Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded men and Thorn's ragged, choking breaths. Solomon stared at the well, then at Ayanna, a sense of awe washing over him. The well wasn't just magic, it was chemistry, a unique geological quirk. The water reacted to certain minerals. The silver in the clay figurine had triggered a toxic reaction, releasing a cloud of poisonous gas from the deep earth. The land hadn't just remembered kindness, it had an immune system, and it had just defended itself. Solomon wasted no time. He quickly tied up Thorn's wounded men. Thorn himself was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. The miracle well had delivered its own harsh justice. He then rushed back inside to the children. He knelt before Ayanna, who was trembling, her face pale. "Are you all right?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "My mother. She said the earth protects its own." He then went to Bidiel, who was now sitting up, looking weak but alert. Solomon pulled the ghost lily from his saddlebag. He crushed the petals and mixed them with a fresh bucket of the clear, calm water from the well. He held the cup to Bidiel's lips. "Drink this," he said gently. The boy drank, and a little bit of color returned to his cheeks. The cure, just like the poison, had come from the earth. The sheriff finally did arrive, alerted by the sound of gunshots echoing through the quiet desert night. He found a scene of bizarre carnage: two wounded men tied up, Thorn gasping on the ground, and a weary old rancher standing guard over three Native American children. Solomon told him everything. The whole story, from the poisoned village to the magic well, to Thorn's murderous greed. At first, the sheriff was skeptical, but then Ayanna showed him the other small pieces of pottery she had, all laced with the same telltale silver dust. And Thorn, in his delirious state, began to babble, confessing to everything, trying to bargain for his life. Thorn and his men were hauled off to prison. The story of what happened at Solomon Tate's ranch became a local legend, a strange tale of justice and desert magic that people would whisper about for years. But for Solomon and the children, it was simply the beginning. He officially adopted them. There was no one left to claim them, and in truth, they had already claimed him. The ranch, once a place of lonely exile, became a home, filled with the sounds of life and laughter. Solomon taught them everything he knew about ranching, and they taught him everything he had forgotten about hope, family, and the deep, hidden wisdom of the land. The well continued to produce its clear, pure water. They guarded its secret carefully, understanding now that it was both a gift and a weapon, a source of life and a tool of justice. Solomon Tate had gone out into the desert to lose himself, to escape the ghosts of his past. But instead he had found three children who showed him the way home. He had offered a simple act of kindness, and in return, the desert had given him back his soul. He learned that redemption isn't something you find, it's something you build, one day at a time, with love and courage. And sometimes the deepest, clearest water comes from the wells we dig in our own hearts. If this story of unexpected family and fierce justice resonated with you, and you believe that kindness can change the world, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next.